It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, last week, our colleague Al Fromm said, in connection with the Supreme Court ruling on legislative action of the state to control elections, that it was too early to tell what direction the Supreme Court was going to go in. That was well before some of the most significant decisions that they've made in the last 5 to 10 years took place right after our broadcast. Do you still feel like the jury's still out, or do we now know this is a conservative court that's going to have some significant political impact on elections in the United States?
Well, not to answer too much like a Washingtonian, I would say I think it's too early to tell, and I agree with Al. I do think that it is a conservative court. There's no doubt about that. It's a unique court, and knowing that you wanted to talk about this, I did a little background reading, as I'm neither a lawyer nor a legal scholar, but this is about politics and about elections. And one of the things that I've said, many have said before, elections really matter. And in 2016, something kind of remarkable happened for the Republican Party. They captured the White House, of course, with Donald Trump, held the Senate and the House. So you had this trifecta. In other words, you had a Republican president who was bound to have Supreme Court nominations in his first term, as he did. Expected maybe 2, got 3. And he had a Republican Senate that was likely to confirm them. And it created a balance, honestly, of what they're referring to as a supermajority, 6 to 3, a supermajority that reportedly we haven't seen in 100 years, nearly 100 years. So it's not that often that we have one party controlling the White House, the House, and the Senate. It's certainly not that often that we have a supermajority in the court. But it would be a mistake, in my view, to kind of go, oh my gosh, how did all this happen all of a sudden? Because as all of us know, I know Al and I know, it's been a long time in the making. You can go back to the Warren courts, you can go back to civil rights laws in the 60s, but conservatives, both elected officials who were conservative, but also conservative jurists, legal scholars, realized that the only way to, in their minds, I think, I'd say, bring more balance to some of the liberal decisions that courts were making was to move more conservative judges through the process, and have spent literally decades in educating, in advancing, in promoting, in electing if it's elected judgeship, or in appointing if it's appointed by a Republican conservative judges. And so it's not like this happened all of a sudden. The groundwork has been laid for decades. And 2016, with a country that was torn and troubled and thought we'd move, many people having thought we'd gone too far in several different directions, elected Donald Trump and provided majorities in the House and Senate. So that set the stage. Now you have the question of, well, how does this court operate? Well, first of all, it's important to realize that it takes 4 judges at least 4, to accept a case. And so with the numbers that they have now, the conservative justices can pretty certainly select cases on which they want to consider decisions by lower courts. Lower courts are actually taking cases that they know will end up at the Supreme Court with the intention of giving the supermajority in the Supreme Court the opportunity to rule on things like race in the case of affirmative action, or voting rights. So it's a very deliberative process. The media has reacted with horror at how conservative the court is. My only point is that if you disagree with the decisions, this came about over many, many years of work with people who were very determined to move the court in a more conservative direction. Now, interestingly enough, while there's a good deal of excitement about the high visibility cases that have been decided, obviously Roe v. Wade overruling the ability to forgive student loans, that sort of thing. The court dealt with a lot of other issues. In fact, the court pretty aggressively selected cases to rule on. And when you look at what legal scholars and legal organizations are saying, it's not necessarily the case that we have 6 conservative justices, all of whom are in agreement on things. In fact, they're not. Interestingly, the American Civil Liberties Union, which in the last term of the court, recorded on their scorecard 5 victories and 13 losses. In this term of the court, recorded 11 victories and 7 losses. So on the issues that matter to the American Civil Liberties Union, they did reasonably well, certainly better than prior years. So selecting cases is important. The tone of the court is important. And I think on this one, Chief Justice Roberts wants, respectful disagreement when it comes. He's kind of urged his colleagues not to shoot at each other. On the other hand, the minority in the court of 3 justices and those who support them want them to be very aggressive, very vocal, very active. And I understand that. And I'm sure they're going to be, because in a way they come from a different generation. They're active, and they're not going to be, quieted or silenced. Hopefully the respect will remain. And that's what the Chief Justice was warning about, that you don't undo the integrity of the court by getting too personal in your arguments. So, I think that it is a conservative court, but it is too soon to tell. Is it moderating? I don't know. I felt like it when we were talking last week, but then we got the decisions we had. Interestingly enough, one of the legal scholars who was looking ahead is looking at the cases the court is likely to take up next time around. And this scholar thought that perhaps the court was, even the conservatives were looking at ways to push back against a very conservative, he called it ultra-conservative, appeals court, Fifth Circuit in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And that's a pretty interesting observation from somebody who is fearful the court might be too conservative, but he sees some indication that maybe they'll push back. I don't think they're immune. I said this before. I do not think the justices are immune from the way the public is viewing them. I do think they look at each case one at a time. They're going to be served up some very tough choices going forward. And I just don't think we know at the end of the day, in a year, 2 years, 3 years, whether they're going to be judged as ultra-conservative. I kind of suspect not, but time will tell.
Al, let's assume that you're correct, that it's too early to tell about where the court is heading. But on the other side, there's no doubt that the decision on Roe versus Wade had a major political impact in this country. They have now ruled against affirmative action, which is one of the great pillars of the great society and our country. But polls are now showing that the ruling on affirmative action has gotten the majority support of the American people. So it's an interesting thing to interpret. What's your take?
Well, I don't know whether the court itself will be an issue next year. I do know that Democrats are basically universally unhappy with the Dobbs decision on Roe versus Wade. an abortion, the gay rights decision, the affirmative action decision, and student loan decision, the last three coming last week. So I'm sure there'll be some temptation for Democratic candidates to run against the court next year. But one of the first rules of politics that I learned from the former Maryland Attorney General Steve Sachs before he was famous, and when I was a young political staffer. And he said, with every setback comes an opportunity. And as you just mentioned, in 2022, the Democrats took advantage of the reversal of Roe versus Wade, and made protecting abortion rights an important issue in the 2022 campaign. And it worked out well. I mean, we cut our losses in the midterm probably pretty substantially. Now, I think the decisions on affirmative action and on student loans give the Democrats a similar opportunity for 2024. And it's an opportunity, if they take advantage of, that can help them reverse what has been a decades-long hemorrhaging of working class voters. But they have to take advantage of it. And that may be hard for them to do because there's sort of this instinctive reaction to the court decisions to voice, your opposition just in whole without really looking ahead. But as you said, affirmative action has not been very popular. The polls have been overwhelmingly against it, and that covers all racial groups. It's not just whites who are against it. Every racial group is overwhelmingly against it. And in California, there was a test in 2020 with a referendum to repeal the ban on affirmative action, and it lost despite the fact that then Senator Harris and Governor Newsom and most leading Democrats were for this referendum, and the proponents outspent the opponents by more than 10-1, and it still lost 57-43, which is an indication that affirmative action doesn't have broad popularity. But that doesn't mean it's not important to have diverse student bodies at colleges. And the Democrats have an opportunity that is not to give up on the effort to make colleges, and particularly the elite colleges, more diverse. But the way to do that, I think, is to refocus affirmative action to focus more on class rather than just on race. As Roy Teixeira wrote this morning in his weekly blog, it's going to proportionally help more minority students, Blacks and Hispanics, than white ones. And so it will at least partially eliminate some of the worst effects of the Supreme Court decision, but it would also help working class white people, white students. And Democrats have had a hard time talking to that constituency. It's become the base of the Trump constituency, and that hasn't proved particularly good for the country. And the idea of creating not only more racial diversity, but also more economic diversity at these elite colleges is a pretty good thing. I mean, at Harvard, I believe these numbers are right, 1%, there are more students from the top 1% of the income ladder than there are from the bottom 60. At the University of North Carolina, which was the other school involved in the court case, 16 times more students come from the top quintile economically than from the bottom. And even among the Black and Hispanic and Native American students who were the beneficiaries of affirmative action, 71% of them came from families that were college educated. That's about 2.5 times, or actually 3.5 times the percentage of overall population. So helping get more working class minorities and working class whites into those colleges is not a bad thing because one of the things that has happened in America over the last several decades, really since the 1990s, is that America, as the engine of upward mobility, has really declined. So getting more students who are disadvantaged into those elite colleges would not be a bad thing. On the student loan forgiveness, that, to me, that I've always been nervous about that because it reflects what's happened to the Democratic Party to make it a central issue, which is that we become a much more college educated based party. And, we all know a lot of people because in our circles who have big student loans, and we'd like to help them. But the truth is that one of the problems is that the way you help them with student loan forgiveness is you have the large majority of people who don't go to college essentially paying for the college education of those whose loans we forgive. Now, I'm sympathetic to having some relief for student loans. And so I'd suggest two things to consider as we move forward. One is means testing. If your family is of great wealth, there's no reason to give you student loan relief. You got to, there are a lot of people like me who put two daughters through private colleges by scrimping and scraping and taking it out of my salary. But the other one is a plan that about 40 years ago, 30 years ago, Barbara Mikulski had. And I think it's a great idea. If students want relief on their college loans, then they ought to have a period of national service. And what Barbara Mikulski's plan was for weekend national service, sort of like being in the National Guard. So you continue to work in your community, but you had to serve on weekends, maybe 2 weeks in the summer, like we did when I was in the Army Reserve. And essentially you're saying, your message is, I'd like the government to help me with pay for my college, but I'm going to respond by giving something back to the Commonwealth. I think these ideas actually reflect, as a Democrat, the core principles of my party. What is the animating principle of the Democratic Party? It's opportunity for all, special privilege for none. And the principle that at least my generation grew up with is sort of the call to action was John Kennedy's call for civic responsibility, or ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Having kids who get student loan relief serve their communities, their country, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah. Craig, I do want to go back to some of these decisions and the public reaction to them. It does seem like the Republican Party should feel like they are on the right track in where they are with the American people. Do you feel that way?
Well, certainly, as I was saying, there's been a long-standing effort to move the justice system, if you will, or the judicial system in a more conservative direction. And so a number of them are applauding that. I had a Republican friend this weekend, in fact, past weekend, come up and say, I voted for Trump. I'm not going to vote for him again. I don't want to see him elected. But boy, it was worth every bit of what we put up with to get these people on the Supreme Court and these kinds of decisions. And a random sample of one, but I suspect that a lot of Republicans do feel that way. Mm. There is, however, a sentiment, and listening to Al's very constructive ideas about how to deal with some of these issues now that the court has spoken. There's also an element within the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives that have come to Speaker McCarthy and said, hey, there's more of us who are in swing districts than there are Freedom Caucus members. And so you keep moving towards the Freedom Caucus, you're making it tougher for us to get reelected. If it's tougher for us to get reelected, your margin as speaker is so narrow, you may not get there. And so they want a little bit more moderation in the direction that the speaker of the Republican speaker, Kevin McCarthy, of the House of Representatives, is going. And so it makes me wonder, too early to tell on this one too, whether the reaction to what the court has done, which may be more conservative than some of the Republicans in the House would want it to go, whether they're going to walk some of that back a little bit, look a little bit more openly at legislation along some of the lines maybe that Al is talking about. Maybe there's more consensus there. Because we're going to go into an election year when typically the people in these close districts don't land at the end of the spectrum of their individual parties. In other words, the far left and the far right are not going to curry favor in these close districts. And so I think the court has set up some arguments that will cause Republicans to applaud what they did, but then look for constructive solutions on moving forward. And I think that's probably a good thing. And I think the path that Al was on is a perfect example of that. Let's get reasonable people to sit down and work through some solutions to things that have troubled a lot of Americans for a long time, regardless of party.
Al, you have the last word.
Well, the court, as I've said several times, is a lagging indicator of where the country's going, because at any time, and it's very obvious now, a majority of the court has been appointed by a previous president, and political winds move quickly. Sometimes when the court makes a decision, it helps the losing side politically. And one of the times was the decision on gay marriage. The Republicans had used that, but as the country's sentiment turned, they were really behind times, and it was becoming a negative issue for them. And the court took it off the docket by approving gay marriage. Affirmative action might be the same kind of thing. But in a sense, certainly abortion was. The winning side is the dog that catches the car, and it's not always the best thing. Look, I think this is a conservative court, and that will continue to be an issue as long as the conservative majority is in place, which is probably going to be for some time. But the challenge, to me anyway, is being probably on the losing side of many of these cases, is to figure out how you take advantage of the losses. Because the Republicans have a very difficult problem as you move ahead. They're basically a very narrowly focused coalition. Almost all of them are conservative and getting increasingly conservative. They're almost all white. They're more religious. They're from the most religious parts of the country, but they don't reflect where the country's going. And that's, over the long haul, that's going to be a big problem for them. And so the court sort of like the old guard hanging on, and they'll make these decisions, and not all of them are going to be bad, but most of them are going to go against counter of the way the country's moving. And so the challenge for the Democrats is not to go crazy in response to these court decisions, but to figure out ways to talk to the broad majority of people who may be uncomfortable with these decisions, but don't want to go radically in another direction. For the challenge, as Craig outlined, for the Republicans, is they've got to start protecting their swing members. Because if they don't, it may take more time because the Democrats always often help Republicans in election years. It may make more time for the demographics to show itself in the political arena, but eventually it's going to happen. I mean, we're very close to having a minority population in this country, and you can't stop it. And so what you have to do is both parties have to adapt to it in a way that continues to build the promise of the greatest country in the world.
We have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.